You know, during the last 2 years, we in the committee have been trying to do things a little differently. We started programs, more programs on Sunday morning, with the intent of involving more religious school people, parents in our programs. And tonight, for the first time, we are having a conversation with 2 scholars, and an important part of the program will be having you interact with the scholar at certain points, and it will become clear when that should be. And they will be responding to your questions periodically. So you don't have to keep your hand up during the whole hour and a half, but they'll let you know when it's time to put up your hand. Now, those of you in Zoom land, as usual, you can pose your questions to our speakers via the chat function on Zoom. And you all know how to do that, and Neil will be curating the questions. Those of you on Zoom, you will be muted. And the reason that we're doing that is sometimes you forget that we can hear what you're saying when somebody walks into the room. So that's why we've muted everybody. Also, I want to thank Emily Kovic, who's back there hiding. She's our Zoom master for today. Both our guests have books published by Princeton University Press. Yay! Yeah.
Yay! Yay!
Okay, let's give a hand to university. Very good. And edited by our fellow congregant, Fred Appel, who is new, or let's say rejoined to the Lifelong Learning Committee this year, and we appreciate his cooperation. And I'll tell you something that you shouldn't tell him, but it's my intention to develop a really tight working relationship with the press, so he can help us get all these superstar academics to come to speak at the Jews.
You can pay them too.
Yeah, okay, that's a good thought. All right, and another benefit that you already can, or we can read, is that TJC has already been designated a community partner, and that's not Fred's doing, because he's not impartial, so we went to somebody else. And so we are a community partner now. So when those speakers come here and we offer to sell the books, we can sell them at a significant discount for you, and that's very important. And for those of you who decide to buy books, there's going to be an informal, impromptu signing of the books at the end of our program. And now I'm going to turn the program to, yes,
The talking.
I already said that.
Everyone knows.
Yeah, yeah, we're good. I'm going to turn this over to Fred, who is a much better public speaker than I am.
Michelle. Okay, well, good evening, everyone who've come out this evening, and everyone who's at home on Zoom. Thank you for tuning in. We understand we have a really robust list of attendees, not just in here, but we've got quite a few people, I think around 50 or so, 50 or 60 people who couldn't make it out here physically. So Moshe has accorded to me the privilege of introducing our guests this evening, our speakers. So I won't take up much of your time. I'm eager to hear the conversation, and I will introduce them in just a moment. Some of you, I recognize that some of you here tonight also attended an event that we had some weeks ago with Professor Shaul Magid of Dartmouth College. And he took us on a dizzying tour of Jewish intellectual history, one of the themes being Jewish responses to modernity. And Shaul, as an intellectual historian, kept things focused on the past, on the transition from the medieval to the modern period. And tonight, we have a wonderfully complementary program because the theme of Jewish responses to modernity remains very important to the work of both of the scholars and authors who will be speaking to us this evening. So one of our guests, our guest from New York City, is Ayala Fader. And Ayala is professor of anthropology at Fordham University in New York City. She's based in the Lincoln Center campus. And she is author of two extraordinary books, both of which are based on her ethnographic research as a cultural anthropologist. And I've had the privilege of working with her on both of her books. Her first book, now over a decade ago, was an award-winning title, Mitzvah Girls, Bringing Up the Next Generation of Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn. That was a National Jewish Book Award winner at the time. And her most recent book, and the book we will be talking about and keying on this evening, is entitled Hidden Heretics, Jewish Doubt in the Digital Age. And that book has also been recognized as a finalist in the most recent National Jewish Book Award competition in the category of American Jewish Studies. Now, tonight, Ayala is going to be in conversation, not with a guest, but with our friend and fellow congregant, Leora Batnitzky. And I wanted to make sure that I have all of Leora's official titles at hand so that I can read them out. Because I can't memorize this. Leora is the Ronald O. Perlman Professor of Jewish Studies, as well as Professor of Religion and Director in the Program of Judaic Studies at Princeton University. She is author of numerous books, the most recent of which we also have copies in the lobby. It is entitled How Judaism Became a Religion, an introduction to modern Jewish thought. And I'm very pleased to say that Leora is also working on a new book, which will be out before long, a book on one of the most interesting and philosophically rich books of the Hebrew Bible, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. And I hope that before long we'll be able to have an event and talk about this new book of hers. Tonight, I believe the format is very relaxed and informal. We have chairs for our guests, and it's going to be a conversation between Leora and Ayala, and there will be ample time for questions, both from the folks tuning in remotely and for the folks in the room. So, shall we begin, please?
Well, thank you so much, Fred. That was a lovely introduction. And thank you, Moshe. And thank you all for having us here in me. And thank you, Leora, for being in conversation. Before we begin our conversation, I'd like to open with an anecdote from Hidden Heretics. It's a story of a particular person, and it lays out a lot of the key issues in the book, and short. But we'll begin our conversation after that. So Yisrael grew up Hasidic in Brooklyn, where, like his peers, he spent long hours studying in yeshiva. He was an earnestly pious boy, but when he was 13, he began to have questions, what are called in Yiddish minakashas. When he asked his rabbi, though, he was told that those kinds of questions came from masturbation. He was silent, stopped asking. He told me he, quote, pushed all of his questions under the rug. At 18, he got married to a woman he didn't know but grew to adore, Ruchi, and they quickly had 5 children. But when he was 29, his questions started again. And because he, like so many other Hasidic men, had started working in computers, he had access to the internet, and he began to go online, reading biblical archaeology, philosophy, and more. Late at night, when his family was asleep, he began to go on popular heretical blogs of the day, and then later in chat rooms, arguing with posters, trying to convince himself and others that the Torah was the word of God revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai, what's called Matan Torah. And then one late Friday night on Shabbos, when his youngest was crying and he knew that turning on the mobile above her crib would calm her, of course, ultra-Orthodox Jews don't use electricity on Shabbos, he paused. He put his hand on the switch. Yes, no, and he turned it on. And that was when he became what many in the community call Bahaltana Apikorsim, or hidden heretics, those who live what they also call double lives, meaning they practice publicly, even at home, but secretly, with new friends, they break Jewish law and explore the wider New York City. Despite trying to keep his beliefs and life, his double life, secret from his family, his wife, Ruchi, of course, noticed, and finally she confronted him. Did he still pray? Did he even believe in God? He confessed everything to her, talking late into the night in their bedroom closet so the children wouldn't hear. She was devastated and told me she cried for 3 days straight. Was her husband crazy? Would she worry her own faith glitch or slip? How could she possibly take on responsibility for the spirituality, the ruchnius of the home, traditionally the realm of the husband? Yisrael was desperate to regain his faith, and he sought out special outreach rabbis to help, what are called kiruv rabbis, but none did. And finally, one day, the Modesty Committee, a shadowy group of self-appointed rabbis, activists, called his house. They noticed that he had recently bought a book on science that included a chapter on evolution for his young daughter. They wanted him to sign a contract agreeing to stop going on social media, and they wanted him to go see a religious therapist who would work closely with his own rabbi. He went to a number of them for fear that his children would be expelled from yeshiva, which would have consequences for matchmaking later on, but nothing helped. And that was when I met him, just as his world was falling apart. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and his story and how it affected his family is one of many stories in Hidden Heretics, of ultra-Orthodox Jews who are experiencing life-changing doubt, but because of their families and fear they cannot leave and go off the derech or OTD, they stay and try to figure out how to secretly build relationships and fulfill their emerging dreams and desires, even while they continue to live as ultra-Orthodox Jews. The internet plays a key role in their ability to stay. The worlds they build with new friends and lovers unintentionally and intentionally may be changing Orthodoxy itself. Hidden Heretics, in fact, are part of a broader 21st century generational crisis of authority among the ultra-Orthodox. Despite an increasingly robust demographic growth, there have simultaneously been loud struggles over knowledge and truths. Hidden Heretics pose dangerous questions in this context. Who should have the authority for making individual life choices? What and who define Jewish orthodoxy or an ethical life? In short, what can Hidden Heretics' everyday struggles tell us more broadly about religious doubt and social change in the digital age?
Okay. Well, thank you, Ayala, for beginning, and let me just also thank Neil and Fred and Rabbi Mero and Moshe, whose birthday it is today. I know that's all right. It's wonderful to be here, and I really, those of you who haven't read this, I highly recommend it. It's a really fascinating, great read, which is one doesn't always say about books published by academics. So I strongly recommend it. So many questions and so many things to discuss, but maybe let's begin with just a discussion of doubt and the way in which you really deal with this issue of doubt throughout. I think in your conclusion, you talk about how neither belief nor doubt is stable. And that both, and that's represented in the lives of the very diverse population that you're looking at. I'm wondering if you could say something a bit more about doubt and how you came to understand it. And let me ask it in connection with two things. So one issue is really this notion of doubt, generally speaking. Because usually if we think about doubt and we think about faith, we might think about, faith in a proposition, like I believe in God, or God is the creator of the world, however you want to put it. And then we think of doubt as rejecting that. And what's interesting is in the history of Jewish thought, there's been a lot of discussion of the way in which that conception of doubt and faith is not a good conception. That the term emunah, right, means something more like trust rather than faith. So I'm wondering if you could say something about that, the relationship of trust. And I guess I'm realizing I should keep my second question, the second part of it to myself. I'll let you. The second part has to do with evangelicals.
Okay, yeah. So as I was doing the research, I came to see that actually I had to define different kinds of doubt, because as I talked to especially religious therapists and rabbis who were trying to help these people regain their belief, I realized that it wasn't that doubt was forbidden, it was that there are different kinds of doubt. So there's one kind of doubt that really defines religion or religious belief, and that is expected, I think, over the course of people's life cycle, of the religious life cycle. It's not that there is no doubt, it is that in order to live a religious life, you expect that there will be times that you will experience doubt, and there are all kinds of ways that religions have instituted to help you deal with that doubt. That kind of doubt generally stays inside individual interiors. It doesn't cause a disruption of religious practice necessarily. You might talk to your rabbi, but it doesn't necessarily cause the kind of life changes that were going on with the hidden heretics that I spent time with. I decided to call that doubt life-changing doubt, because that was a doubt that refused to ebb and flow and that refused to stay inside. It actually had to come out, often through conversations and interactions with other people. And despite many people not wanting to experience that kind of doubt, it actually did disrupt religious practice. It caused people to stop wanting to continue to practice and obey and follow all the commandments. Usually when that happens to people, and there are cases of evangelicals and Mormons who have left their communities, people leave because it's very difficult to have that kind of disillusionment, that kind of doubt that it makes it difficult to continue on in your religious community. But the hidden heretics that I was spending time with couldn't. They were married, they had children, they were usually prominent people in their own communities, and they felt they couldn't hurt their families. They knew that if they left, they would hurt their children. Many talked about not wanting to hurt their parents. They said it would kill their parents and break their hearts. And so they stayed. But staying was a compromise in some way because they couldn't stop from exploring new ways of being. And often those ways of being came from being online and meeting up with people and sometimes having lovers. And it really changed their lives dramatically, and it changed their senses of who they were. But that kind of doubt, even though it was kept secret, ostensibly, almost always spouses found out with serious consequences. There were familial consequences, not only for the individual. Children often found out, especially as they grew older. So now to your second question, which is an interesting one. I really struggled with how to translate emunah, which in the Yiddish variety is emina. And I think what I would say for the people that I worked with is there was the sense of trust was really in what many people called in these communities the system. It was a sense that they trusted their rabbis to mediate for them what the right way to be an ultra-Orthodox Jew was, a Hasidic or a yeshivish Jew. And I think that is actually something that defines many religious orthodoxies, which is less of a Protestant individualized relationship to God and more of a whole social structure, actually something that you've written on yourself, a cultural system really, that you can't separate out the religious component. But when there was a violation of trust, then when people had life-changing doubt, it was often the sense that they no longer trusted the religious authorities in their lives to give them what they thought of was the truth. I was really surprised when I started doing this research at how often people talk to me about belief. As an anthropologist of religion and post-Halal Assad and many other anthropologists, there's an emphasis much more on embodied practice and discipline And people don't talk about belief as much. Anthropologists didn't talk about belief as much. So I had to account for the ways that the people that I was working with actually did talk about belief. And what they talked about to me, and this is the faith part, was really that there was a moment for all of them where they no longer believed that what was in the Torah was God's word. And that brought everything else tumbling down. In fact, I was just talking to someone on Sunday and I said, well, why couldn't you just move a little bit to the left religiously when you felt that? And she said, we couldn't because we were raised with this was the truth. Everything was black and white and there was no middle ground. And so the faith part is really about belief in the truth of the giving of the Torah. It's not necessarily about God. And it took me a while to figure that out also. There were many hidden heretics who rejected that the Torah was the word of God, but who still believed in God. And there were many who were agnostic. So there's a whole continuum that I delineate of different kinds of life-changing doubt. But all of those doubters actually stopped believing that the Torah was the word of God. For some of them, they just sort of became Reconstructionist or whatever denomination you want to say and said, well, okay, that's fine. I can still live an ultra-Orthodox life. I can believe that this is created by humans. The Torah is the humans channeling God, but there was a really deep mistrust of what they all called the system. And that's where the trust came in.
So thank you. I think it's really fascinating. I was really surprised myself by how much this issue about belief in the Torah being given from God, how central it was. And it really struck me at the beginning of the book. You quote a number of times throughout the book Tanya Luhrmann, an anthropologist at Stanford, I think also published by Princeton University.
Yes.
And her work, and she looks a lot at evangelicals, but it struck me in this way that how this really was much more close to some kind of evangelical conception, in the sense that the word of God was so central. And again, that was surprising and maybe perhaps something also very American. I'm wondering if maybe you want to say something about that.
Yes, it is very American. And I think even a lot of rabbis in the past decade, ultra-Orthodox rabbis, have been talking about a crisis of Emunah or Emina, and many people translated that to me as a crisis of faith. So definitely adopting some of the language of Christianity and probably evangelicalism. But, and I think that, but still so different because it's not necessarily, I mean, what Tanya Luhrmann writes about is really about the individual encounter with God and that personalized relationship. That is not what I heard about at all. I think the emphasis and the use of the term belief or faith is definitely an adoption from that, but I think it has a very different meaning actually for the hidden heretics that I worked with. And one way you can see that is when people lost, as they said, belief and came to doubt the truth, not the truth of the Torah, but that it was divinely revealed. It wasn't that everybody wanted to leave necessarily. There were, of course, some people who did want to leave, but there were also people who then, hidden heretics, who then recast ultra-Orthodoxy as a lifestyle. That was what many of them called it. So that they didn't necessarily, initially I was like, oh, you want to become like me. But in fact, that wasn't true. In fact, they were very critical of so-called secular life. They thought that their ultra-Orthodox lifestyle was beautiful. They loved living across the street from their families. They loved celebrating Shabbos, all of that. The truth, the truth of that, of why they did it, that would no longer felt real to them. And what they were looking for, many of them, was a different kind of ultra-Orthodoxy, one that was more tolerant of having different kinds of ideas and different ways of expressing, and probably a reaction to some of the stringencies that were imposed post-war. That whole slide to the right.
So maybe I'll just make one more comment and maybe we'll take a couple questions.
Sure.
Do you want to do that? I have many questions.
Yeah.
And so don't, we won't do only questions. But what struck me also that was interesting was how similar many of the people you interviewed sounded like people I know, potentially even at the Jewish Center, in the sense that yes, they didn't necessarily believe these things, or they definitely didn't believe these things, but they nevertheless liked the lifestyle.
Right.
And so it actually made the people you discussed seem much closer
Yes.
to a kind of broader Jewish experience than I would have thought. And I'm wondering if, and also I should just mention that you said they like the lifestyle, but they also continuously call it culture.
Yeah.
And so that's also what's very interesting. I mean, again, things one could hear from, from very different kinds of people.
Yes, that's all true. However, at the same time, it wasn't that they became more tolerant of other varieties of Judaism,
Sure.
right? Like there was a lot of outreach from modern Orthodoxy to a lot of these people, like the answer you're seeking is to come be modern Orthodox. And they found modern Orthodox services and Shabbases just meaningless, like not culturally touching to them in the ways, and that's I think around the aesthetics of ultra orthodoxy, like what what people are comfortable with, the taste, the smells, all the sensory experiences more than anything, and that's the cultural part to me. But I do think that there's both a questioning that's very familiar to other denominations of Jews and a kind of struggling with what it means to live an ethical life. And at the same time, a real judgmentalness about other varieties of Jews.
And I'll just say, I think actually that's also describes other forms of.
That's probably true.
For other.
Yes, that's true.
Jewish communities are so open to other.
No,
forms of
you're absolutely
Judaism
right.
as well. Should I ask one more? Do you want to take a couple questions?
Sure, do you have questions?
Okay. So my brother was Lubavitch, and so I have a couple of questions. My family growing up were not. He was there for Chuban, and I'm wondering if you found that people that converted or whatever you want to call it, if there were more instances or fewer instances of leaving. And then I have another question that he became less religious as like when he got divorced, and he had a whole divorced group.
Yeah.
And they weren't as religious anymore. I mean, they were still very religious, kind of the way you were describing. And I was wondering if you saw that too, with divorcees or anything.
Those are interesting questions. I think that no one really knows the statistics of how many heretics there are and how many people who are orthoprax, meaning they practice but they don't believe. It's very difficult to find data on that. I quote some in the book, and I have to write a disclaimer because I don't know if that's accurate. But I know that there are lots of ultra-Orthodox people who would like that to be the reason, that there's more people who are returnees to the faith who then lose their faith. None of the people I worked with were. They were all FFB, which is from birth. And I didn't make that up. And they were all, as I said, quite prominent and comfortable. Not all, some were. There are very prominent stories of prominent people who have gone off the derech, like Shulam Dean wrote a memoir. Maybe some of you have read All Who Go Do Not Return. And his father was a returnee to the faith. So that's an easy explanation. I think what really made a lot of the rabbinical leaders concerned was that these were people who were not easily blamed. Like it wasn't that they had parents who weren't good parents, and it wasn't that they had mental health issues, because many of them didn't until they had these doubts, and then they got depressed and anxious like anyone would. And it's not because most of them couldn't make a living or were marginalized. So they really posed a dilemma for Orthodox people, ultra-Orthodox people, because the narrative is, if you're raised by good, from parents, why wouldn't you choose that? Why wouldn't you stay? And even the hidden heretics themselves, who were often very tormented and wanted to just believe, felt that same way. Why can't I just believe? And many people told me that they went to religious therapists and rabbis and got yelled at, like, why can't you just keep practicing? Your faith will return, just do it. That's how it works. And they couldn't. And the divorce, it's really hard to be divorced among, especially Hasidic people, especially for women. I can imagine that there are groups of people who spend time together. I didn't encounter that. The networks of friends that I was working with, some were divorced and some weren't, but they were a network of friends who were united by a certain time that they spent online, like starting in the mid-2000s, and then they became friends through mutual, really intellectual and emotional ties.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so you just mentioned psychology.
Yes.
And so one of the many things you discuss in the book is the way in which the doubters are pathologized. Could you talk about that a little bit? How the different kinds of therapy that came in, both in terms of this focus on interiority, which is also really interesting and very American, and accepting that aspect, and also some of the effects of some of these therapies, which you talk about liking to sort of some conversion therapies.
Sure. So the shift to interiority, I first read about it in Bina magazine, which is an Orthodox ladies magazine. And a rabbi wrote, we used to be able to rely on levush, which is clothing, the exterior. But now with the internet, we can't. We don't know what anyone's interior is. And I found through my research that there was a lot of activism around the internet and trying to contain it. And we can talk about that also more. But there was a shift in the way people began to talk about how to protect one's Jewishness and Jewish soul. And the idea that it used to be enough to look different, there was a sense that there was a vulnerability that was emerging. And this is about the last 10 or 15 years or so. So I do tie that to the internet. But in response to a real feeling, especially among rabbinic leaders, that ultra-Orthodox Jewish interiors were at risk. And that actually is a term that people use, like a person at risk, meaning at risk for losing their faith or for life-changing doubt. So there was a whole new cavalcade of professionals and semi-professionals who were brought in to minister to those kinds of concerns. I will say that in the 1990s, that the adoption of therapy was slow but sure in Orthodox communities. In the 1990s, Rabbi Tversky, who was educated to be, he has his PhD, I think, and a medical degree in psychology, wrote a series of really fascinating books that merged Mussar, which are ethical writings, with AA, with Alcoholics Anonymous, which worked beautifully, by the way. And so he wrote a whole series of self-help books that came out in the 90s. And so gradually from then on, there's been a movement among ultra-Orthodox Jews to be a little more tolerant of therapy and self-help, and with it a kind of holistic approach to the person. And it was a real shift in ideas about what constituted Jewish people, in fact. Like, it used to be almost kind of medieval ideas about the soul. And there was a shift that was definitely influenced by the American therapeutic movement that really permeated. I mean, they're not, you could say they live in, ultra-Orthodox Jews live in enclaves, but they clearly are squarely in America and living within, flows of knowledge and all of those kinds of things. So if you go into any prominent bookstore in Brooklyn, you will see whole shelves of self-help books using very familiar language and Jewish concepts as well. So when this crisis of Emunah was discussed, that one of the answers was, well, they need therapy, they must be mentally ill. And so that actually was some of the real trauma that people who had life-changing doubt also experienced, that they had all these doubts, they couldn't get rid of them, and they thought, I must be crazy. And many of them sought out therapy, and many of them also sought out semi-professional therapists. So there's a whole evolving group of life coaches who are sort of trained. I think it's not a very rigorous training Sometimes women went to their college teachers, their bride teachers as a first step before they went to therapy. So there were a whole range of people who actually minister to people with doubts. Usually that's enough. For these people that I'm writing about, it wasn't enough. So they would go to either a life coach, sometimes they went to Lubavitch Maspias, who are like spiritual guides. Sometimes they went to a bride teacher or a groom teacher. When that wasn't effective, many others either sought out or were forced to go really from their rabbis or their spouses to a kind of therapy. Some were pushed toward religious therapy, which is a new field since the 1990s. The organization is Nefesh International. You can look at their website, and it's a very interesting organization. I went to their annual conference, which was startlingly like my own professional conferences. It wasn't that different, except that many of the panels were different. And there's an attempt to, like Rabbi Tversky, who was one of the keynote speakers, actually, to merge Jewish concepts with psychological concepts. There was a rejection of Freud. Obviously, one of the therapists told me he kept his Freud locked in a closet where his clients couldn't see. But in general, there was a kind of embrace of things like cognitive behavioral therapy, quick fixes that didn't involve a lot of talk therapy. And in the most serious and egregious cases, and they were not the majority, but that I do write about, there was I think an overdiagnosis of certain mental illnesses and an overdiagnosis of prescription drugs. And so one woman in particular who wasn't sure she wanted to go public with this story, but felt so strongly that she had to tell her story as a warning note because she had heard it multiple times. And I heard many other situations like this. I was diagnosed as being bipolar, was given heavy duty medication, really was out of it for several years, and then finally took herself to a non-religious therapist and had a completely different diagnosis and got off those drugs and became something of a hidden heretic, but was able to make her own decisions working with that therapist. So through the networks, and that's why it was also so important that these hidden heretics keep in touch with each other, because they could advise, go to this therapist, don't go to this therapist. This therapist will tell everything to your rabbi, this therapist will not. And so I think it's a kind of moment among religious therapists where people are telling stories now, and there's a reckoning. I've heard several conferences where they're talking about like, what is our role here? And I will also say that not all Orthodox Jews have rejected conversion therapy either. The Nefesh organization was going to host a prominent conversion therapist until the media caught wind of it, and then they had to quickly disinvite him. So there's and that's also very similar to evangelicals.
Yeah, conversion therapy.
Oh, sorry. That is somebody who tries to pray the gay away. It's for to change someone's sexual orientation.
So one of the things you just mentioned with the woman, I'm not remembering her name, but the one who was diagnosed as bipolar, it did seem that women in general,
Yes.
have it much harder. I mean, this is a common story generally about women in psychiatry.
Yes.
But when we turn specifically to the experience of being a hidden heretic, it actually didn't seem that bad for a lot of the men.
No.
Like they had a lot of friends. Some of them obviously were very torn, but a lot of them seemed to have a lot of friends, and they seemed to have time to sort of hang out with their friends and other heretic friends and discuss these things, whereas the women were really trapped and isolated.
Yeah, and it's not surprising. This is a community with very strictly defined gender roles and gender separation. So it's not surprising that life-changing doubt would also be gendered in that way. But it took me a while to figure out all the different levels of how that happened. I will say that there are structural reasons for why men and women have such different experiences, especially once they're married. When girls are in high school, ultra-Orthodox girls, they actually have a lot of independence. They go shopping, they take the subway into the city, they do a lot of things. They're very active in school. And it was always hard for me to think about like, oh, these are Hasidic girls who are shy and modest, like they were out there. But at the point of marriage, their lives are really oriented toward their home. At that same point of marriage for a young man who's been studying yeshiva from like 6 in the morning to 9 at night, once he's married and he's maybe studying in kollel for married men, yeshiva for married men for a couple of hours a day, he has a lot of free time. It seemed really, I mean, it was liberating for the young men that I hung out with. I used to meet a group of guys in Barnes and Noble, and they were just sitting around drinking coffee. You know, it was like being in a European cafe. So there's those structural reasons. Men also have built-in social life and mobility. Men can have cars if they live upstate. Women don't drive. Men after Shabbos, the Shabbos meal, go to shul and hang out with their friends, or after davening, they hang out. There's lots of times where no one knows where they are. I guess they have their cell phones, but no one knows where they are, and they're just hanging out. They have a lot of, as you say, schmooze time. Women are expected to be home watching the kids, and they are, if they're not home or if they're going out at night, their husband wants to know why. So those are the structural reasons. The very experience of life-changing doubt was also gendered. When men had life-changing doubt, the majority described it as just devastating. Some felt suicidal. It was a real loss of their purpose and ethical orientation and a sense of who they were. I mean, it was devastating. People told me they lay on the couch for weeks, they couldn't move. I mean, there was a lot of serious depression. Women were also very, very sad, but a number of them also described their anger at having given up many of their dreams for something that they thought was true that they no longer felt was true. So there was a lot of anger there. And as you say, in terms of the people who were trying to help regain a sense of faith, there was definitely a kind of emotional explanation for women and intellectual explanation for men. Women, many rabbis and women therapists, religious therapists would say like, oh, she just has a bad marriage. If she had a better marriage, she wouldn't have all these questions. But for men who have a long history of intellectual challenging from the Haskalah onward, from the Jewish Enlightenment on, the explanations were like, you're too smart, you read too much, you shouldn't have gone to the library. But the implication was you're too intellectual, which was never something for women. And in fact, the hidden heretics that I worked with also often called themselves maskilim, which is a Jewish enlightener. So sort of drawing on this, it's a negative past if you're ultra-Orthodox. I thought, having been raised in a very different tradition, I thought that was a real positive. They were referring back to another group of rebels who back then were also sparked by a new technology, which was the printing press, but a group of real Jewish intellectuals. And so they were able to draw on this historical tradition as well.
So just in connection with that, and then maybe we'll take a
Yes.
couple questions. Just
Yeah,
in
you
connection
can.
with that, one of the things that was also interesting, right, was the way in which some of the people saw themselves in light of Jewish history. So that's one example. Some of the men see themselves as masculine. Another example is you talk about people seeing themselves as reverse Moranos.
Yes.
And another example is your discussion of Purim. So could you say something about the reverse Moranos and Purim? Again, I think the fascinating aspect is how the hidden heretics nevertheless still see themselves within a Jewish story.
Exactly, and within an Orthodox Jewish story,
Yeah.
yes. So there were many terms that I had to decide whether I was going to use or not for the term hidden heretic. And one of them was what is called the RM, or a reverse Morano. And there was a whole subgroup, it was really like a clique of friends, who called themselves reverse Moranos, meaning that they identified themselves with Jews during the Inquisition, Moranos, who were forced to practice secretly, except they were living the reverse story, where they were forced to practice Judaism and had to secretly explore non-Jewish ways of life. So for a while, there was this big RM group on Facebook, which I never got access to. I was mad. I almost got access to, and I know they talked about it, but they never felt like they wanted me to be there. They didn't want to be, as they said, a guinea pig, which was fair enough. So there was that. And I'll talk about Purim in a minute, but what's really interesting to me is that there are certain key points in Jewish history that both rabbis and hidden heretics or RMs play with. So rabbis often say that the internet is more dangerous than the Holocaust. They always refer to the Inquisition, and they always refer to slavery when we were slaves in Egypt. And hidden heretics also refer to those, and through the reverse Muranos, through the Haskalah, all of that. I went to this amazing Purim party 2 years in a row that was thrown by reverse Muranos that started way later than I had ever stayed up and continued throughout the entire night. But what was fascinating to me was the ways that people's dressing up. I mean, Purim is a holiday of inversion, so that's not anything unusual. But what was really fascinating was the ways that hidden heretics dress themselves up and use the masks that are part of Purim to go someplace that they really shouldn't have been. It was a huge fancy gathering with mixed men and women dancing. Everyone was taking drugs and drinking, and everyone was partying, but they were all wearing masks. Somebody was wearing a gorilla suit. You know, everyone was so hidden that they could explore this in a very safe environment, which is something that the internet provided as well. So should we have a, yeah.
So a couple of, first of all, the stuff about self-defining myself as being crazy, or the system defining them as crazy, it shows sort of the mutability of the definition of sanity.
Yes.
Because many people might consider the system to be the craziness, and or certainly have some aspects of not being well adjusted to reality. The second thing is that this raises an ongoing question that modern liberal Jews have. How should we consider the ultra-Orthodox altogether? Because you look at the way they interpret, reject real evidence, and the way they are so insular and refusing to engage the rest of the world and trying to prevent people from engaging in the world, that it makes it very difficult for, at least for me personally, to reach across to them as Jews, because they are so ill. I feel very sad for the people who think that they're crazy, when in fact they're becoming sane, as far as I know.
Should we take two at once, maybe?
Yeah, I was just gonna piggyback on that at the risk of sounding like one of those Jews who's judgmental of other Jews. There is a part of me that when I read these stories about, ultra-Orthodox yeshivas that try to prevent children from learning anything except, Yiddish and Torah, and these people that are telling people not to question and not to read anything and not to go on the internet and not to leave the community. And if you even think of leaving, then you're gone and your children get punished. I mean, it's like a cult. And so at least that's how it reads to me. And, I don't want to think of other Jews as being in some kind of a scary cult, but it does sound kind of cult-like to me. And I wonder if you had any of those feelings at all as you were doing this research.
Yeah, those are interesting questions. It's funny because that Sunday meeting that I mentioned that I had, those three Hasidic women who were hidden heretics were like, well, Lev Tahor is a cult. Like another ultra-Orthodox group is a cult, but not them. I think one of the things that happened once people did have a crisis of belief was that they began to define ultra-Orthodoxy as a cult. To me, as an anthropologist of religion, I don't see a real difference between a cult and a religion. Maybe as a religious studies scholar, you don't either. It's sort of like the difference between a dialect and a language. Max Weinreich says the difference is an army. I think that's accurate. That works for me. I do think that to qualify ultra-Orthodox Jews, especially in the States, as so insular and not reaching across the aisle is inaccurate. I think they're reaching across different aisles. I don't always like the aisles they're reaching across, but they're actively engaged in politics and economics. One of the difficult parts for me as a researcher sometimes was, and this is more from my first book, was that many of the Hasidic women that I was working with felt sorry for me, like that I had a terrible upbringing, as a Reform Jew. They thought that was just so sad. So I mean, that lack of recognition for other Jews, that's definitely part of an ultra-Orthodox perspective. I wouldn't say that they're insane in terms of the way that you're saying that. I think it's a different attitude to what is meaningful in the world, and that definitely for Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews in the States, it came out of the rebuilding after the Holocaust. So there's a kind of stringency that was put in place to really rebuild. I think there's a lot more, and I hope that I have captured this, there's a lot of dissent in ultra-Orthodoxy today that I think is not always represented fairly. And I think that fourth generation ultra-Orthodox Jews are contesting what it means to be ultra-Orthodox and whether they really can't go to the library or not. My issue with children, I think that's a really difficult topic, right? I mean, it seems clear to me that the main issue in the New York Times articles about the yeshivas is they're taking federal money and they're not abiding by the law. That seems relatively straightforward. But when you think about whether children in illiberal or non-liberal religious communities are somehow being abused, or because they are being brought up by parents who don't believe they should go to the library or that they should read about evolution, sometimes I don't know where I come down on that, frankly. I mean, is there a special role for children where there's some kind of universal human right? I think that's a slippery slope. And, you know, if you look at the UN rights of the child, those are quite culturally particularistic. You know, there's like, you can't have physical discipline. There are lots of people in the States who wouldn't agree with that. So it's a really tricky question with children. You can say the same thing with children in evangelical or any kind of Orthodox religious life. Is it up to secular liberal people to make those decisions? I'm not sure. And where is harm exactly?
But are you saying even if those schools were receiving federal funds, are you saying that the community should restrict, like, learning about?
I mean, even if they weren't receiving federal funds.
I thought the issue was that they were.
They are, and so
Yeah.
that's why I'm saying I think they have to abide by state laws to teach secular subjects.
Okay,
That seems
okay.
clear.
Okay,
But if they, you know, like, look at the Amish, right? So they don't accept federal funds and they only have an 8th grade education.
Mhm.
That troubles me. Am I able to tell them not to do that? I don't
No,
think so.
that strikes me as different.
Is it?
It's different in the sense that they're not receiving. I mean, I think in our society, if a group is receiving federal funds
Yes.
for a certain purpose, then that purpose should.
No,
be
absolutely.
provided.
That seems clear. No, what I was saying was that seems clear, but if yeshiva said, no, we're not going to take federal funds and we're still not going to teach boys, contrary to girls who do have many secular subjects, we're still not going to teach them English or math, would that be okay?
I see
It's
that
troubling.
as being in a different, perhaps in a different category.
Yeah,
So what I wanted to kind of add to the mix, and thank you so much for the learning tonight, is my fear, kind of based on a little bit of what Harold is saying, is that, you know, we're in this time now of, you know, this algorithm of anti-Semitism, like
Yeah.
racing all over the world, right? It's just like, it's all over us. I mean, Joe Rogan, who I never heard of, you know, saying things that Jews are into money, like Italians are into pizza, it's like, okay. But there, I think from the Gentile world looks at what you were talking about in a very like, oh my God, like, and I heard people say this at conferences near Lakewood, where, oh, they're in Lakewood.
Yeah.
They're ruining the town.
yeah,
And, you know, and people have a right to, you know, be in their communities and, you know, to the whole tapestry of beliefs and customs. We all want that. But that gives me the chills as a liberal Jew, that all of us are being painted with this, they're ruining Lakewood, they're not supporting the funding of the public schools,
Right.
they have their representatives on the school board, but their children are not going to the schools, and I'm not asking you to resolve that for us tonight, but it's troubling.
Yes, it's absolutely troubling. I think we see this most of all with COVID and the measles before it. I was just doing WhatsApp with somebody who said, when a Hasidic woman, who said when it was the measles and there was a prominent group of anti-vaxxers in Rockland County, upstate New York. And she said, we were all so mad. They were making us all look bad. It was increasing anti-Semitism. No one would play with my kid on the playground. And we saw that in New York City with COVID as well, like a refusal to shelter in place, and it made all Jews look bad. It goes that way. And I think it goes the other way too, where sometimes like visible Jews get more anti-Semitism. So there's a sense of awareness for them as well. But, it also raises the issue of how far can an illiberal community go in a liberal society before the liberal state and the liberal citizens will no longer tolerate it. But for Jews, I think it has a special complication because it's a reflection of other Jews, no matter who you are. And it's troubling, yeah.
So in your research and work, you've talked about the differences between responses for men and women and how, and I wondered in those ultra-Orthodox communities where the majority of women are working, besides having
Yes.
7, 8 children, they're working too.
Yep.
Do you see differences in those women's responses to this issue to ones where they're not out, they're not reading, they're not, they are, I don't know if you've seen anything.
Yeah, recently it's been really interesting in the past, I'd say 5 years or so. I wouldn't say it's a feminist movement, maybe. There's definitely Orthodox feminists in Israel, and there's of course there are also here, there's an Orthodox feminist movement, but there have been a number of ultra-Orthodox women, especially posting on Instagram, actually. So it's through social media again, who are business women on Instagram and who have gotten very powerful. They're called influencers. Actually, Jessica Roda is an anthropologist who has a book coming out on this. And I see women complaining about certain practices, such as not showing women's faces in magazines, or not having enough childcare, or managing, their jobs and having children. So I think there is. I will say that there is something afoot because there was a huge anti-Instagram rally led by rabbis just this fall to force women to get off Instagram. So something's going on there. Women are able to kind of manage sometimes a career in a large family because they're on social media. Like you can have, there's big entrepreneurs who show their stuff on Instagram. So, and a lot of women get information from other women. I've been trying to track this in some new research I'm doing, where I've gotten very interested in the kinds of alliances between evangelicals and ultra-Orthodox Jews, because politically they have increasingly come closer and closer, and they're both using very similar language around religious freedom that works for them legally and also works for them on social issues. And when I've been interviewing women, I haven't heard them talk about I read, this book by an evangelical pastor's wife about how to be a good wife. But there's a kind of trickle-down effect that's facilitated by social media, where a woman who is either Lubavitch or maybe modern Orthodox will repost something from a non-Jewish woman or a less Jewish woman, and then ultra-Orthodox women might go online and just sort of troll around, not troll, we'll just sort of go around and observe and read and not post. But there's a kind of news cycle that's happening among women that I think is really interesting and different, that's equally politically to the far right, but often through women's issues of like holistic health and healing and self-care, like very familiar kind of therapeutic, again, frameworks.
Yeah, thank you both for such a wonderful conversation. So my question is really from one anthropologist to
Yeah.
another, a recovering
Yeah.
anthropologist. So I'm really curious about how you made an entry into these various communities as a woman to the men, and then as a woman with other women, what that entry was like and how you developed trust and how those boundaries were for you. It's very
Sure.
interesting.
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot and work on a lot. So for my first book, Mythical Girls, I mean, you can really get entry to anywhere if you're patient enough, but I think the key was that the women that I was meeting, I was interested in language and the body, Yiddish and the body and how parents raise their daughters. Women finally agreed to talk to me because they hoped that their example would make me more observant. So it was
Yeah.
the classic, like, you know, we'll do you this favor, you're writing a paper for school. I was like, no, I'm writing my dissertation, I hope it's a book, and they were like, we'll help you with this school project. They weren't worried about, you know, me coming into the girls' school, which was interesting data for me. I got kicked out of the boys' school, but they would let me into the girls' school for a while. So there was that whole push and pull in my first project. By the time I was working on this book, I had already become a professor and people knew me from my first book. So I actually wasn't planning to write on this topic at all. I was like, I'm done working with ultra-Orthodox Jews. It's hard. I need to do something fun. And I was going to write one more paper on Hasidic bloggers because that had come after my research for my first book. And I started to talk to this Hasidic blogger, and it slowly emerged that there were all these people online doing all these new and interesting things that I had no idea was going on. So what surprised me in this second project was it was incredibly easy to gain access to hidden heretics. Number one, they knew who I was. Number two, I was a professor. These are all autodidacts. They were really interested to talk to me. Number three, I think it was really interesting for them to tell me their life story. Many said after an interview, like, oh, this felt like therapy. You know, I was quick to say, like, I'm not a trained therapist, but I think there was something really intriguing to narrate their life story in that way. So, you know, one person introduced me to another. At a certain point, I realized I was only talking to men, which was really surprising to me because in my first book, I never said anything to any man in any community. I said, gods, that was it. So I was like, where are the women? Like, what's going on here? And why am I talking to men? I understood why they were intrigued to talk to me, but so little by little, that started to show me that women were much less public. Eventually I said, please introduce me to your women friends. And little by little, they were much more hesitant to speak to me. And it took a long time to get women comfortable. Eventually I got into a group of friends and we hung out a lot and that was fine, but it was really different experience, always because of my own positioning, shaping the research. And I will say that life coaches and rabbis and therapists were really reluctant to talk to me also. So it was kind of the reverse in many ways. I think there was a lot of concern about airing dirty laundry. I know there was a lot of concern because people told me they didn't want to air dirty laundry, like religious doubt was dirty laundry. And they also, they were, I think, unsure about their own professionalism in terms of some of them didn't really have degrees, but they were practicing anyway. So there was a kind of like as an informal economy, which many ultra-Orthodox participate in an informal economy. I think people weren't willing to go public. Eventually I found some therapists and life coaches who were willing to talk to me, but it was much harder to gain access to that. It really surprised me.
Thank you.
In that connection, what has the response to the book been?
Oh,
from
that's
some of
an
the-
interesting
some of the
question.
people
Yeah.
who-
It's funny, somebody just wrote to me right before I came here. I read your book, can we talk? It's like, who are you exactly? You know, it's been, the people involved in this book were really invested. And they nudge me all the time, like, when is it coming out? Like, where are you in the book? It's been a while, like, hurry up. So they were really invested because they really wanted to be seen as ethical actors. So far, the closest group that I've worked with, I know they don't talk about it because they recognize each other and they've made a pact not to discuss it together, but individuals have told me that it was very affirming for them, which I didn't actually go in with an axe to grind, but many people have told me that it was important for them to read the book, that they were glad that they weren't alone. This woman just told me I felt very affirmed. And the other interesting thing that I didn't know, well, I'll tell you two stories. The funny thing that I didn't know until very recently was that sometimes giving my book to another friend who was ultra-Orthodox was a sign that you yourself are a hidden heretic. So if you loan this book to a person, you're making a little gesture like, you get it? Are we okay? And so some people have become friends over my book, which is a nice story. They found each other. And what was most gratifying to me was the woman, I always forget their pseudonyms. I think it's Fabi, who was diagnosed as bipolar and mismedicated. She really, at the last minute, I think I told you this, Fred, I'm not sure, but at the last minute, she wanted to pull her story. And I had to go over it line by line. And I worked with another friend, person in the book who read the whole manuscript. We had to really make sure that her anonymity was protected. She was very anxious about it. And I didn't hear anything from her. I sent her a book. I sent all of them books. I didn't hear from her for a year. And she wrote to me a year later and she said, I just want to tell you, so far, there's been no fallout. I finally sat down to read it. I haven't been reading it because I never read it because it made me too anxious. I sat down to read it. I read it in one sitting. It wasn't even boring. It was well written. What else could you? Right. So that was very, I did not hear from the psychologist that I sent it to, and I really wanted to. I really respected a few of them who I worked very closely with. I know that maybe they didn't want to comment or, yeah, I didn't hear from any religious authorities at all. At least I'm not in Chayrim, like not in the band. Yeah.
I guess as a follow-up to that, because it's so interesting, did you feel that those personal connections that you inevitably establish with people and the genuine concern for representing them, did that interfere at all with the sort of academic approach and your methodology and the theories that you were either investigating or discovering in the process?
Yeah, that's also a very interesting question. I mean, I think for me, at this point in my career, I really hope that, and with anthropology and a kind of state of like, what does it all mean and what are we doing, and a real push toward more public scholarship, I felt like my time with these people really moved me. Mm-hmm. It didn't make me partisan. I mean, at first I was like, oh, these are terrible religious therapists. I'm gonna, unmask this terrible thing. But when I spent time with religious therapists, I was really moved by their earnestness with what they were trying to do. They thought they were doing the right thing. So here you have a group of people who are completely at odds, living really unlivable contradictions. I found the earnestness and the kind of truth seeking of all of the people in this book really moving. And so my job, I felt like, was to convey that in a book, to make these people speak to any reader and ask them to question their own choices about what it means to live an ethical life and what it means to raise your children to want to be both Jewish and ethical actors. So I see that more than theory building. I mean, I'm as much interested in social theory as the next anthropologist, but my goal was really to write something that made social theory mean something. And I mean emotionally.
Yeah, thank you.
So go ahead.
I wanted to ask a question about now. Yeah,
all right.
You addressed a question earlier about conversion theory, and you explained it, which suggests that this is a way that this particular ultra-Orthodox community deals with sexual orientation. So you came across people, you know, in your research who were gay.
Yeah.
But, you know, earlier, maybe it was over dinner, we talked about how hidden heretics also use the language of being closeted,
Yes.
kind of metaphorically. Like I'm in the closet, I'm hiding my true self from my community. So they're borrowing this language from the gay community. And they're using it to describe themselves. So it seems that in the communities you were researching, this language of gayness and closetedness was both metaphorical, but there's also literal instances. So could you explain more about what you encountered in terms of metaphor or reality of gayness and sexual orientation in this community?
Yeah, that's very interesting. You know, no one I worked with was gay, or at least out, you know, and I explored that because it surprised me. And many people told me that if you discover you're gay before you're married, you mostly leave. That it's, as one woman said, it's just too lonely. Like it's just too hard. Now I know there are prominent people who are gay who make a match because they want to have a child, have children, and stay in the communities. And I've heard of cases where the wife had a girlfriend and the husband had a boyfriend. It was actually a very good match because they were both gay, and they lived a publicly orthodox life. But eventually, their children sort of called them out on it and were like, "Why do we have to lie all the time like this?" And eventually, both people left. At least in terms of what I know. So I think in some ways this is a heterosexual story. I think that, and part of the reason why I didn't elaborate the closet metaphor so much, like there's a whole, you know, closet metaphor coming out of queer theory. A lot of the people that I talked to didn't like that term in the closet. I think it's gained more traction within the last couple of years. Maybe as attitudes to LGBTQ have changed in ultra-orthodoxy of certain groups, you know, of hidden heretic groups, certainly not among ultra-orthodox. But I think that there was a kind of, I think maybe initially they didn't know the reference, and then once they did, they were not that into it.
Because they were a bit homophobic, perhaps?
Yes, I think perhaps, yes. And I'll say that didn't go away so much. And the other thing that changed, like as people became increasingly, as they had life-changing doubt and they themselves began to change dramatically, there were certain political positions that changed. People became much less racist. They were much more, they embraced like more progressive liberal values, but there was still a lot of holding on to old ideas about gender and about sexuality. Those were much slower to change among men. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Two different. How do you feel like most of or some of the people saw your identity, saw your Jewishness? We have this concept of Klal Yisrael, but I don't know if they consider us part of that Klal.
Yeah.
So that's the first. And the second, did you find at times that they were interested in finding out about your secular life or your liberal life and used you as an entree into this world?
The answer to both of those is no. No, they didn't. I was assuming, I mean, I taught some people what mescaline was, but that's not a really big accomplishment. You know, you could live without and baby. Like I took people out to lunch and they were always like, "What is this mescaline? What is that?" But no, and I think that was really a good thing for me to figure out, was that I was not a model. I mean, I think they really were interested in higher education. And I think the academic part was very intriguing, but I don't think that they thought too much about my Jewish orientation or were that interested. I mean, one of the litmus tests for talking to me was, "Are you an atheist?" I was like, "I guess so, sort of." And they were like, "Okay, I'll talk to you." So, I mean, they were worried that I was secretly religious and that I was somehow spying on them, you know, because there is a lot of kind of surveillance of, you know, neighbors and friends and even family members who surveil for a good.
But did they feel that sense of kinship that we talk about, Jews among Jews, with you?
In a Jewish key, I don't think so. I didn't feel that, and I don't think they did either. I mean, I was once having coffee with a hidden heretic, and I said, oh, I have to go home and finish my Rosh Hashanah brisket, and he said, oh, you remembered you're Jewish. So I don't think so, you know what I mean? And then, but a minute, like 5 minutes later, he texted me an apology, like, I'm sorry, I forgot myself. I think that tolerance for other Jews is a very particular liberal value. And I don't think, I mean, one of the real challenges of the ultra-Orthodox or any Orthodox community is, can we tolerate in a liberal society the illiberal? You know, the people who don't tolerate us. And I think that's a real question. It's a philosophical and political question. And that's what I meant when I said I don't think they want to become conservative Jews. It doesn't speak to them. And if you're raised with the idea that it's ultra-Orthodoxy, and in particular, either one Hasidic group or one yeshivish place, if you're from Lakewood, like, you're raised with the idea like, this is it, this is Judaism. Other forms of Judaism don't speak to you. They are not meaningful, and they don't seem quote unquote authentic. I think if you're raised and you go to a Reform or a conservative synagogue, that's not your own upbringing. And you're, you know, as part of tolerance and pluralism, we tolerate all different kinds of Jews mostly. We don't even tolerate the ultra-Orthodox, ironically, you know?
Thanks.
We have a question on the chat from a Zeitlin, and she's asking if you learned Yiddish for these projects.
Hi, Roma. Yes, I did. We didn't speak Yiddish at all in my home. I come from a very Zionist background. When I told my grandmother that I was gonna learn Yiddish in graduate school, she said, why would you ever learn that language? It has no grammar at all. It turned out not to be true. But I went to summer programs at Columbia and YIVO, and I had to learn Yiddish much more for my first book. And I learned Yiddish because I knew that women and children spoke Yiddish together. What I didn't know was that women really spoke English among themselves, Hasidic women that I was spending time with. So I am a very fluent first grade Yiddish speaker, first grade girls Yiddish speaker. I can say things like, give me that crayon. It's a real American, like, give me your crayon. It's a very American Yiddish that has a lot of English in it. But yes, I did. And I'm still studying Yiddish because it turns out that online Yiddish is having an incredible moment. Hasidic online Yiddish is really having this moment. I call it enlightened Hasidic Yiddish. It's facilitated by the internet. It's often written by either hidden heretics or men who call themselves aufgeklärt, meaning enlightened. And contrary to what you might think, writing on, on Twitter or writing in chat rooms has actually enabled a lot of, it's mainly men again, to discover Yiddish writing as a form of personal expression. And now there are Yiddish magazines that are meant for entertainment and not only moral didactism. So, and there was recently a meeting of Yiddish editors to discuss standards, like grammatical standards and spelling standards, which Hasidic Yiddish has been remarkably unstandardized, which has always fascinated me because it's really a kind of purist philosophy of Judaism with a very unstandardized, unpurist language ideology. But that's changing, I think, thanks to the ability for people to write, especially anonymously.
Yeah, part of this thinking about it is it's so hard to really understand. So why a very bright person who is Hasidic, who doesn't have doubt and doesn't, how do people's curiosity about the world? I mean, you said that people are living here, they're living in America, they're exposed to things. How is that not a contradiction for more people?
You mean, why don't more people have life-changing doubt?
Yeah.
You could ask the same thing about us. I mean, why haven't you converted to ultra-Orthodoxy, right? Like, you're living your life, you're doing your thing, you're raised in a certain kind of way, you're raised with knowing what's possible, what's not possible. I don't think they're so different. And I do think that if you can learn not to question certain things, there's parts of living an ultra-Orthodox life that can be deeply satisfying. You know, your mission is clear, you feel you're doing the right thing. You have all of these levels of your life and all of these institutions telling you that this is the way to be Jewish, this is the way to save Jews and Judaism. It's a powerful statement, I think. So it takes a lot for someone to say, and often it's not by choice, I think, for someone to say, I'm really curious, let me see what Darwin had to say. Like, can I reconcile that with what the Torah says? You know, and so, but I think it takes a lot for any person to do that in their own society. Toward the end of the book, I write a little bit about Galileo and Spinoza, like people who really shook up because of their philosophies, but they were often ejected from their communities. So there are serious consequences for people like that.
Yeah, I wonder if you think anything's changing in that regard. Do you think there will be more heretics and fewer hidden ones in these communities, and perhaps as generational change happens, some loosening up of some of the issues around it?
I do, actually, and I know that that's probably accurate because around a lot of ultra-Orthodox communities, you now have like a little sub-community outside of those communities where people who are not quite in the community anymore have still chosen to live. So you have like Muncie, and then you have, you know, in upstate New York, and then you have Airmont, which is a place where many not hidden heretics necessarily, but people who are no longer fully into their communities are living. You have the same thing with Lakewood, like nearby is Tom's River, where other kinds of people live. So I think there's a geographical marking of certain kinds of changes. And there's also new terms emerging, like modern Hasidish or Hasidish light, like LITE. So I do think that generationally, there's a kind of pushback. I quote one person in the book who said, like, why are you telling me that I can never look at a boy and I can never talk to a woman or never use a smartphone, like talking to rabbis? Like, why are you telling me that that will, you know, make me turn into somebody I'm not? I'm strong enough to do that. So I think there's also sort of what we were talking about, a changing idea of the individual, which is very American too, you know, and has caused a lot of angst among other members of the community, I think.
Another question from the chat from Nancy Osborne. When you say you met the men in Barnes and Noble, do you mean that they were willing to sit in public with a woman, and is that allowed?
It's definitely not allowed. Well, I guess if I were a reporter, it would be allowed. I meant that they were, yes, willing to be seen in public, but also that they had time to sit and schmooze. I mean, there's Barnes and Noble, milk is kosher, they can sit in Barnes and Noble, that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. The fact that they were sitting in a bookstore and talking about heretical ideas was the real issue. And the fact that they were meeting me and I didn't dress modestly when I met everyone, when I did the project for my first book, I did dress modestly because I was going into girls' schools, and when I got married, I covered my hair. But I decided to come as myself in this field work. So in the summer, I wore short sleeves and I just wore jeans. So that was probably a little more suspect. And there were a number of people who would not meet me in public, or who said, you know, walk behind me till we get into Starbucks, or who came to my office. For example, my office was a very useful place for people who didn't want to be seen. And even now, usually people don't like to get together inside their neighborhoods. We meet elsewhere. So you go to Park Slope instead of, you know, Borough Park or Williamsburg.
Sure.
So,
I'm very reluctant to say sure. I'm riveted.
yeah, well, I just, let me just say on behalf of everyone, thank you. This has been wonderful. I think one of the really great things you've done is you've really humanized everyone in the book, and you also show how diverse this community is.
Yes.
That perhaps we shouldn't just say the ultra-Orthodox. Yeah, and so thank you for that.
Thank you, and I really want to thank you for being in conversation. It was a treat to meet you after reading all your work.